And so I wanted to welcome you all to this discussion this afternoon, or as for some, good evening. I myself am currently in Iceland, and it's 7 p.m. here. We're excited you could join us to delve into the diverse field of hydrogen and its potential in the energy transition. I'll be the first to admit that I know very little about the subject, except for the fact that hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe. I'm Saga Helgason, and I co-chair Stanford Alumni for Climate Action, or SACA for short. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to tell you briefly about the group, which is hosting today's event. Stanford Alumni for Climate Action is a non-partisan group of Stanford alumni deeply concerned about the devastating effects of climate change. Our purpose is to educate ourselves and inspire the wider community at Stanford to join us in taking action, whether it be small and large, individual and collective, to address this existential challenge to life on Earth. We have some exciting events coming up, so please stay tuned for those. And we'll be posting some relevant links in the chat a bit later. Now, on that note, there are some key takeaways that we hope you get from our panel discussion, and these include an understanding of how hydrogen might help achieve our decarbonization goals, and also a deeper appreciation of the trade-offs when considering energy transition solutions. And now I'm thrilled to introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Naomi Boness is co-managing director of the Stanford Hydrogen Initiative. She is also managing director of the Natural Gas Initiative at Stanford, a program that conducts research on natural gas with a view to maximizing the environmental, social, and economic benefits. She holds a PhD in geophysics from Stanford. And then Dr. Narendra Pal is the CEO of Pacific Hydrogen, a California-based company whose focus is offering cutting-edge expertise in hydrogen technology to both businesses and governmental agencies. He has led several federal government-funded projects, and he is a 2022 Stanford LEAD GSB alumni and board member of SACA. He's also a mechanical engineer specializing in developing safe and effective hydrogen infrastructure. Now, given their deep and practical knowledge of the field, I'm really excited to hear them discuss both the virtues and the challenges of converting to hydrogen as a clean fuel. And there will be plenty of time for questions at the end, so please feel free to submit those. And now, without further ado, I will now hand it over to Narendra to start the discussion.
Thank you, Saga. Thanks for very nice welcome and introduction of us. And to start with, I think we have a very special guest today, Dr. Naomi, who is the Managing Director of Hydrogen Initiative at Stanford, as Saga told. And in addition to that, that's my personal view. She has a position and a responsibility to make a positive change for hydrogen economy. So let's start and welcome Naomi. And just for the audience benefit, I will start with the information that you also had a natural gas initiative in addition to hydrogen initiative. So what's the rationale behind that, heading the same person, both natural gas and hydrogen? Over to you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Saga, thank you for staying up late. I really appreciate you and that lovely introduction. Yeah, so I run two research programs at Stanford, one on natural gas and one on hydrogen, and they both sit within the School of Sustainability, and every single project within these programs has a sustainability component. So I, really think about decarbonizing the fuel space. And I think of natural gas and hydrogen sort of on a continuum, right? 4 out of the 5 atoms in natural gas are hydrogen. So this makes a lot of sense, right? We don't have to be chemical engineers to sort of understand that we can decarbonize using hydrogen. I share this group's concern about the climate challenge and the urgency of getting solutions in place. I work on natural gas because I recognize that, we are using natural gas today. And that is not the end goal, but we should ensure that it is as sustainable as possible. So to that end, we do a lot of work thinking about, reducing methane emissions, measuring them, working with operators to figure out how to make it as clean as possible today. And then thinking about how we can use it to, for example, support the deployment of more renewables. So in my mind, this is work that all fits really nicely together. As we try and electrify as much as possible, we might, get to, I don't know, 40 or 50% electrification. And hopefully all of that electricity is produced using renewable resources. But that still leaves a massive chunk of our total consumed energy that is fuels. And that's the space that, hydrogen can play a huge role in decarbonizing.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. I think, yeah, so we should, like everybody agrees that even if we want, like we cannot do everything with hydrogen. And that's not the, intention also. There is a place for all the fuels, and we should be using optimally and optimally using our resources for the society. We cannot just for the sake of proving, we cannot do that. So that's a good rationale. So moving on to next question, like how hydrogen can help in decarbonizing various industries.
Yeah, so, I think it's important to note that part of the challenge with the energy transition is that there are no silver bullets. So, as you said, hydrogen is going to be really helpful in decarbonizing that fuel space. But even if we sort of maximize that decarbonization potential, it's going to account for something on the order of about 6% of the necessary reductions we need to get to net zero. So it's important, but it isn't going to be, a solution that is applicable everywhere. So to that end, I do think it's really important that we think about where we're going to apply these solutions and do it really thoughtfully, particularly if we're going to use green electrons, green electricity to make hydrogen. We have to ask ourselves the question, are we getting more bang for our buck in terms of decarbonization if we use those green electrons directly to electrify buildings or passenger cars or rail or any other application? Or would we be better served converting them to hydrogen and using it as a fuel to decarbonize sectors where electricity is not an option? So those are predominantly transportation, particularly heavy duty transportation. So, a lot of us are driving electric cars now. I think for passenger cars, electric makes a lot of sense. It might not be the only solution, but I think it's going to be the primary solution. But as we get to heavier road vehicles, particularly, large Class 8 trucks and freight vehicles, you start having challenges with electric. So one being the charging time, right? If you're a delivery person, you don't want to have to be forced onto a schedule where you have to stop and charge for 8 hours. Whereas you can refuel the same truck in maybe, I don't know, 5 to 10 minutes, right? At a regular refueling station. The other issue is really around weight. So batteries are very, very heavy and they take up a lot of the payload space. So again, if you're, a delivery truck, you want to maximize the space that you have for your merchandise. And so hydrogen is much lighter and much more space efficient. I also think, we're thinking about hydrogen for shipping purposes. Might not be as pure hydrogen, but ships are also quite hard to decarbonize, particularly for long distance international shipping routes. Electric is probably not going to be the preferred solution, again, because of those challenges with batteries. But shipping companies are really looking into hydrogen derivatives, so things like methanol and ammonia as options that they could use instead of bunker fuel. And then aviation, again, not using hydrogen directly, at least not in the near term, but thinking about how we might blend that and make sustainable aviation fuels. And then the other category of sort of decarbonization applications is really within heavy industry. And this is both for industry that uses a lot of heat and power, and that is very hard to electrify because of the high temperatures required for processes like steels and metal refining, for example. And so hydrogen could be used potentially to replace the coal or natural gas that is currently being used to generate power. And it can also be used directly within the chemical processes. So for example, in steel, the refining of iron ore to steel uses hydrocarbons, either coal or natural gas, as the reducing agent. And we could actually use hydrogen, or we could make a synthetic hydrocarbon from hydrogen to use within that process to decarbonize the amount of CO2 that's being released.
Very good. Yeah. So that's like it has a wide variety of applications, like focusing on like base rule is like focusing on the heavy duty where you need a lot of energy, and obviously by nature of batteries, they cannot be applied there because they have a limited amount of storage time. You can go bigger, but the time is limited for 5 hours or 6 hours. So long duration, wherever there is any application, hydrogen is there. So that's the basic rule.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and maybe I'll just say one more thing, Narendra, which is, I think the real promise of hydrogen is in storing green electrons that we wouldn't use otherwise. So what do I mean by that? In places like California and Texas and New York, where we have a lot of renewables, during the middle of the day, and especially during the summer, there's a lot of excess electricity that is being produced that isn't being used.
And that means
Right, because we have to overbuild, right? Because in the early hours of the morning and late at night, we don't have enough renewables. So if we could figure out a way to economically turn those green electrons into hydrogen and store it to use at times when the wind and solar in particular are not having a high output, I think that would be a really useful and beneficial application for hydrogen.
Yeah, so I agree, fully agree. And that's I think it works very good as a long duration energy storage. Once you made hydrogen, you can store for months, even for years.
Yeah, and we do that today, right? We do it with natural gas. So across the United States, we have, I don't know, 400 underground reservoirs full of natural gas that we use to balance the grid and avoid blackouts when wind and solar are not producing at the same level as the demand. And so we could think about using hydrogen in that same way.
Yeah, exactly. So what will be in your views, what will be the pathway to achieve the green hydrogen? Because world over, everyone is talking about green hydrogen, not focusing on like other ways. Obviously, there is a reason for carbon intensity, but what will be the pathway like before reaching that green hydrogen level, or ultimately everybody is producing green hydrogen? What will be the transition in your view?
Well, I think, in the United States, part of the reason that there's a lot of momentum around hydrogen is because it's been recognized as being of ubiquitous use in so many different applications. There's policy in place, particularly the Inflation Reduction Act policies, that incentivize production of hydrogen. So the first thing to say is that in the United States, the policies focus on low carbon hydrogen. That it's a an incentive that is tiered depending on the carbon intensity. So I think it's, super important to think about the broad suite of hydrogen pathways, and really keeping our eye on the ball on reducing emissions and not locking in necessarily to a single technology. So I think about, clean hydrogen. It could be green, which is made by splitting water using clean electricity. It could be blue potentially, where we take natural gas, make hydrogen and capture the carbon to store or use in other processes. It could be through nuclear pathways, right? There's been sort of a renaissance of interest in nuclear, and we could use that electricity in the same way that we use renewable electricity to split water. And the benefits of that being that nuclear runs 24/7 and is super reliable. So I'm thinking about all of those pathways, and I think really focusing on carbon intensity. So with regard to green, so using primarily wind and solar, there are a few challenges, right? So one of which is that we have limited wind and solar resources. As I mentioned before, I think we have to be really mindful about making sure that it's really the best use of those limited resources to make hydrogen and not use them directly in some electrification process. But I think there are places where it would make a lot of sense to do that. So the challenges now are really around the policy requirements in order to make this economic. So green hydrogen, to make it, is on the order of maybe $5 to $8 a kilogram, depending on where you are and depending on what your resources are. And that's compared with about $1.50 through the traditional ways of making hydrogen from natural gas.
Yeah.
So we have to, use those incentives to get that production cost down. And we're waiting right now on the final guidance and whether or not we'll be able to use the grid, whether or not we will have to match the production of hydrogen with the production of the clean electricity in real time, or we can average it over a year. These are all things that will affect whether or not these projects are commercially viable.
It's complicated, obviously, and government's intention is also that, like, whatever they are spending, it is going to the right cause. Like, if they are giving it for low carbon intensity, it should be, they will make sure that it goes there.
Yeah, I think, one thing that I think a lot, at Stanford is really sort of being intellectually honest about all these different pathways. So, I think that we're on the right track to say, what's the carbon intensity of hydrogen today? Okay, you get about 10 kilograms of carbon dioxide for every kilogram of hydrogen. So they've said, okay, you have to be below 4. So you have to have a reduction of 60% in your emissions to get any benefit at all. And it has to be basically 0 in order to get the full $3 a kilogram incentive.
Correct.
The issues I have are that for the natural gas pathways, we take into account all of the upstream methane emissions from the production of the natural gas, which I think we should. Right? I think that we should be honest and really try to incentivize the industry to reduce those methane emissions. However, when we think about the solar and wind pathways for making hydrogen, we don't take into account the upstream emissions associated with building the solar panels. And often they're made overseas and then transported here, and there are emissions associated with that. So I think, we should sort of be thinking about these life cycle analyses in a very systematic, scientific way, and not picking and choosing what we include in those analyses, because it leads to a biased understanding. And the truth is that all of these pathways have some emissions associated with them. None of them are perfect, but we should be comparing apples with apples when we talk about life cycle emissions.
No, that's really important. Accounting is important, and it should cover everything. You know,
And
when we are
I'll give an example maybe. So we wrote a paper recently that looked at this issue. It was published in Nature Communications. A really talented student at Stanford, Justin Bracci, was the lead author, and we looked at how the grid is going to evolve, and in a decade from now, what would be the emissions associated with hydrogen made from the grid in somewhere like California, which is, we know, they're going to put like 85 gigawatts of renewables on the grid in the next decade. So it's going to be really, really clean. And the emissions associated with green hydrogen using that super clean grid are still on the order of 3 to 5 kilograms of CO2 for every kilogram of hydrogen. So, I think we have to wrap our head around the fact that all of these projects are incrementally better than burning fossil fuels, and we should absolutely embrace them, but that none of them are perfect. And it really doesn't make sense to pitch them against each other, because I think getting the hydrogen markets established should be priority one for everyone, right? It's not going to be perfect today. Let's just get the markets going, because we know that in a decade, as our grid cleans up, we'll have an abundance of green electrons to use. And at that point, it will be significantly better. And the analogy to that is the sort of rollout of electric vehicles, right? Electric vehicles rolled out across the country, and we're trying to get those markets going now, knowing that in some states, owning an electric vehicle and plugging into a coal-based grid is worse than driving a hybrid or a gasoline car. But it's worth it now to get those markets going, so that as the grid cleans up, we'll be in a better situation.
Yeah, no, that's very important in understanding whole value chain actually, and not just doing for the sake of doing it and just following. Okay, so moving on to next. So what do you think, like as an industry as a whole, what is the mood like? Are they for it, or they are waiting for more results to come up, or more favorable government policies? What is the mood at very high level?
I think we're in a holding pattern right now. Globally, something on the order of $300 billion of hydrogen projects have been announced. Many of those, large green hydrogen projects. I think there's maybe 6 that are on the order of a gigawatt or more. But many of them are waiting to see what the policy guidance is around the Inflation Reduction Act 45V tax incentive. So of that 300 billion, about 10% have actually reached final investment decision, actually have committed dollars associated with them. So I think there's, I think we experience this big wave of excitement, right? Particularly when the government, puts so much of their resources behind this. It's very, very exciting. Hydrogen is sort of really the only scalable option that we know about today for decarbonizing this fuel space. And now we're plateaued out a little bit in interest, maybe, because the economics are tough. And, rolling out any new technology depends on the support of policy. So initially, the first phase are really around these production policies, but there's also, we need policy support on the demand side too. So there's a DOE H2DI, which is the Hydrogen Demand Incentives Program. So they have $1 billion that they're going to allocate to the demand, the customer side of the equation, to really sort of help with the cost imbalance that still exists between hydrogen and incumbent fuels, even with the production incentive on the production side.
Yeah. So as you said, like only 10% are seeing the light as of today. So overall, what are the hurdles you think, and they need to be addressed immediately or in a medium term before we are able to realize the economy, hydrogen economy?
Yeah, the tough thing about hydrogen is that the whole value chain basically has to be built out, right? So I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat around storage, hydrogen storage, transportation, distribution, and I do see a lot of hurdles that have to be overcome within that. I actually think for the most part, there are some technology challenges, but we know how to make hydrogen. We know how to make it with relatively low emissions. Do we need to improve that? Do we need to think about how to make electrolyzers sustainable? Sure. Do we need to figure out how to get carbon capture and storage projects underway? Sure. Yeah, we've got some work to do, but we know how to do it. And the same with distributing it. There's something like 3,000 kilometers of hydrogen pipeline. It's kind of privately owned for companies, mostly along the Gulf Coast. But we know how to do that. We move it around in tube trailers today, which isn't very efficient and is quite expensive. But we have to build the infrastructure, right? So the tough part, and this is true for, I think, everything within the energy transition, is that in order to move forward with any of these solutions, we have to put steel in the ground. We have to build stuff. And that is where we're sort of reaching an impasse, because the permitting and regulatory frameworks are notoriously difficult to navigate. It's very hard to get any physical infrastructure project approved. And I also think, we have a lot of work to do engaging with communities. I think we're all sort of, realizing that there have been a lot of harms in the past, particularly in vulnerable communities. And as we move forward with any of these projects, we have to really step back and ask, what are the community benefits of this project? And how are we including our communities in the decisions of where these projects will be sited and how they will be built, and how people in the community will benefit by having jobs or benefiting directly from the clean power and lowered emissions. So I think, there's a lot of hurdles, but in my mind, those permitting and construction and community engagement hurdles are the largest hurdles that we have to address.
Yeah, and also it's a gigantic task, so that will need time at least. And before we realize it, there will be proving things, several technologies, several actually on ground. So as you mentioned, like a hydrogen hub initiative by the government. So what do you think, like how it is helping? Is that enough, or we need much more, or we need little more? What do you think?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Well, I think that the hydrogen hubs are an awesome way to prove up much of these technology concepts, right? So the DOE allocated $7 billion in total to the hydrogen hubs. $6 billion was given directly to 7 hubs across the country. And they're all focused on different things. So, the hub in California is mostly focused on green hydrogen through electrolysis of water. whereas the hub, you know, on the Gulf Coast, for example, is mostly focused on blue hydrogen because they have natural gas resources there. So a big mix of technologies. $1 billion was held back for the demand side incentive. And with the $7 billion that has been allocated to these hubs, you know, it comes with $40 billion of cost sharing from companies. So the whole, you know, that's a lot of cost sharing, right? And those projects within the hubs are only economic under certain policy conditions. So again, you know, I think the hubs are waiting right now for the final guidance around the hydrogen policies to figure out which of those projects is going to be commercially viable. So even though they're supported by the DOE, they still require some policy support in order to be economic. But they're a great opportunity to really get some critical mass. So as we're, you know, building hydrogen infrastructure, being able to share that amongst many players within a small region is really a cost-effective way to go about getting that infrastructure in place. And then I think the goal would be to then think about connecting those hubs, right? So, you know, we're at phase 1 right now. There's a lot of excitement, but also there's a lot of uncertainty over which of the projects within the hubs is really going to be economically viable.
Thanks. I think that was really important information because from far, like everybody only knows that okay, there is a hydrogen hub program going on where like billions of dollars are being spent. That's good, but not realizing that we may need maybe $100 billion to build it.
It's a huge undertaking, yeah. So, you know, I think in order to, you know, really build out hydrogen infrastructure across the country, we're looking at decades and decades of and billions of dollars.
Right.
Yeah.
And, very, very common question people ask is like, or the perception they have, like US is behind Europe. Europe is doing much more. So what do you think when it comes to the hydrogen projects?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I don't know. I think there's a lot of activity going on all around the world. So Europe kind of got out ahead of it. They had some funding dedicated to hydrogen in the COVID relief package.
Okay.
But you know, and they have a lot of international cooperation. But they have actually, it's been taking a while to get some of the projects underway. So for example, there's some pipeline projects, and it turns out that permitting in Europe is also really hard, and communities want to be involved, and you have to build trust, and that all of that takes time. I think, you know, we're in a slightly different position in the US. So we rolled out the IRA package, and it created just so much buzz. Everyone was so super excited about it. And now that's kind of softened a little bit in the sort of realization of the requirements to get those policy incentives, for example. But I think, you know, Japan and Korea are also really moving forward with their hydrogen strategies. I read recently, you know, 41 countries have a national hydrogen strategy with targets, very specific goals and targets. We're all kind of seeing hydrogen as the solution to many problems, right? Because it can be used in so many different applications. And because in the US we have a variety of abundant resources, right? We have great renewables. You know, you look at places like New York, Texas, Washington, New York, they're all putting renewables onto the grid, and that's really exciting. But we also have really cheap, abundant natural gas that is keeping the lights on for many people around the country, and keeping costs down with regard to our energy bills. So we have some different challenges compared to, say, Europe, where particularly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the cutting off of the Russian supply of gas to Europe, they're in a different position where they're willing to pay more of a premium sometimes because they don't have natural gas available to them directly. And the same is true for Japan, right? Pretty much whatever energy Japan is using is being imported. And so the economic viability of slightly more expensive hydrogen is higher there than it would be in the States, where we could use much, much cheaper natural gas instead. We're just battling some different constraints. But I think ultimately, there's a lot of sort of excitement around the international movement of resources through hydrogen, and in particular ammonia, which is used to carry hydrogen. So I'm very excited about how all these different regions are putting their plans into action. But I wouldn't cast it as the US being behind Europe in any way.
Yeah, no, I understand now, as you explained, like the parameters are different. Like for countries like Japan and other countries in Europe, for them, energy security may be much more relevant, under their local situation compared to the US. And so they have to store it for longer period, and they are dependent on outside energy much more than US. So yeah, that makes sense. So, so I think the final question, we are nearing like 12:40, and see if you have to say like overall, how do you see hydrogen economy changing the overall energy scenario, like on a global scale, maybe 10 years from now?
Yeah, so I mean, I think of hydrogen as one piece of the jigsaw that we have to put in place. I think it could have a huge impact. But like I said before, it's not going to be the silver bullet that changes everything. I think the promise of hydrogen is really around maximizing the output from other renewable energy sources, because we're not rarely are we finding hydrogen directly in the earth. It means that we're always converting it from another energy source. And that's a really, useful thing to know, because then it kind of puts you in the mindset of using hydrogen as an energy storage mechanism. And that's going to be really powerful as we transition our whole system to be reliant on more intermittent renewable resources. Having energy storage is going to be a primary consideration in maintaining reliability and affordability, actually, for people that are, not in a position to double or triple their energy costs.
I think now we can take up the questions. I think we have at least 15 to 18 minutes. So are you able to see these questions?
I think so. Yep.
So if you want, it's your choice which one you want to take up, or from top to bottom.
There are a lot, but I'll start. Okay. Yeah, great question from Michael on how difficult or costly is it to modify natural gas storage facilities into hydrogen storage. There's only maybe 8 or 9 active facilities around the world that store hydrogen underground, and they are typically salt caverns. So hydrogen is a very small, in fact, it's the smallest of molecules. Which means it likes to sneak through small spaces. So salt is a really good medium to store it in, because it has very low porosity. It's also inert, so the hydrogen doesn't interact with it. But we have a number of studies going on at Stanford to look at, are there depleted oil and gas reservoirs that you could use to store hydrogen? Because there's many more of those than there are salt caverns, and that would make it, much more geographically diverse. So there's lots of criteria that we're thinking about, and really putting together a roadmap to say, if your oil and gas reservoir meets these conditions, then you could use it to store hydrogen. But we're really in the early phases of figuring that out. And it's not so much a case of converting them to hydrogen as understanding if they're amenable to being hydrogen storage facilities. Next question. Please explain why even a clean grid is associated with so much CO2 emissions. I didn't understand that. Thanks. Okay. So this was a question related to the paper that I was talking about. So even if your electricity is emissions free, so it's 100% wind and solar, say, there are emissions associated with the manufacturing of the solar panels and the wind turbines and the transportation of those to the US. Usually they're not made here. So manufacturing solar panels in particular comes with quite a lot of emissions associated with it. And so what I was trying to say was that as we think about these different pathways, we should be thinking about the full life cycle of those pathways, from manufacturing of the components, delivering of the feedstocks, construction, and operation. And often with green hydrogen projects, we just focus on the operation, but that's not the full story. And we have to be careful as we design the energy systems of the future, that we're not just sort of putting in place carbon leakage mechanisms where we're shifting emissions from the operations at home to the manufacturing of components overseas, for example. I hope that was clearer, Sharmila. Mike Botello asked a question about storing and transport and what infrastructure challenges need to be overcome to drive adoption. Hydrogen is really hard to store and transport. You're exactly right. And again, it's a very, very small molecule. In fact, it's so small that it can penetrate through many metals. And we call that embrittlement. It changes the physical properties of the metals. In particular, we talk about it in relation to pipelines, and it can cause those pipelines to lose integrity. So that's, a very serious issue that we have to figure out. Now, there are ways to store and transport hydrogen. Often we use fiber-lined metal containers or pipelines, but those come with a cost. But again, I think the biggest infrastructure challenges are not the materials themselves, but it's really thinking about how and where we're going to build that infrastructure. So, for example, building out a whole pipeline network comparable to the natural gas system doesn't seem like it's very feasible, given the community concerns and the opposition to pipelines in general. I will say with hydrogen, the other thing about storing and transporting it is, it's a very light gas, which means that it's very hard to compress it. So it takes up big volumes. So for example, if we were to think about it in relation to natural gas, the same energy density of gas. So if you had a volume of hydrogen that had the same amount of energy as a volume of natural gas, it would take up 3 times the space. And this is really important because as we think about it in terms of using it for, let's say, shipping, it's not just figuring out how to make engines that run on hydrogen on the ships. It's figuring out how to store it on the ships. It's gonna be a big volume if we use hydrogen directly, which is why chemicals like ammonia that contain hydrogen are often used in those situations. But it's also going to require us rethinking the infrastructure of the fueling facilities on shore at the ports. So the regular bunker fuel storage tanks, we would require 3 times the volume in order to store the same amount of energy in hydrogen or potentially ammonia or methanol.
Yeah, correct. And I've seen like couple of like Kawasaki heavy industry, they built one tanker, such tanker, and Samsung is building on another one. So we need a lot of them to
Yeah.
move around.
Yeah. I saw a really cool presentation by the International Maritime Organization where they were talking about the promise of making hydrogen from wind, offshore wind, and basically having a network of refueling stops so that the ships didn't have to go into port to refuel, but could refuel out at sea at the offshore wind facility. And I just think,
Oh.
that is a vision, for far into the future. But that kind of infrastructure, we need to start thinking about what that might look like today and how we're going to have to do things differently with the use of intermittent renewables.
Yeah, and it needs like a cooperation from the government level. When IMO is there, so that means it requires all the governments on the same page, and they should agree. So that's really impressive if we can build that one. Definitely, we'll have to build it. Matter of time, when we are able to do it.
Mm-hmm. A question about the direct use of hydrogen today, and how those uses might evolve. Okay, so today there's about 100 million metric tons of hydrogen produced globally, about 10 million in the United States. And it's about 50% of it, give or take, is used for making fertilizers, and about 50% of it or so is used for refining, mostly oil refining, some metals refining. And then there's some smaller fraction that's used in chemical as a chemical feedstock for things like urea and whatnot. But in the intermediate term, I really think that transportation is where we're likely to see the biggest adoption of hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives. So certainly up until now, that has been the decarbonization market that has grown within the United States. So in California, we have, I think, 53 hydrogen refueling stations. And that was really driven by the low carbon fuel standard here in California. That was a policy specifically to decarbonize transportation fuels.
Right.
But that's, I think, clearly where, the biggest adoption of hydrogen has been here, and also in places like Europe. The longer term applications, sort of thinking about it for energy storage, we have quite a lot of technology challenges to work out before I see it being a widespread use.
Hydrogen can excuse me, definitely play a role in they call long duration energy storage. So there is not everything can be helped by the hydrogen, but there is some part of it when you really are interested in kind of interrupted power and for a longer duration. So there hydrogen can help definitely.
Yeah. No, I definitely see an application for it. I just think that it's not likely going to be at scale in the short term.
Right.
Oh, I like this one. Should we be focusing on the applications which don't require distant transport? Well, maybe is the answer. So I think, there's been some really interesting studies. Stanford's worked on some, but there's been lots of other people sort of thinking about this idea of centralized production, which is what we have today, right? So hydrogen is made centrally in big volumes through steam methane forming. But if we think about the use of renewables, we might want to rethink that and sort of think about decentralized or delocalized modular production of hydrogen. So I think, particularly in places like the Midwest, where, you could imagine making hydrogen locally for ammonia production that would be used. It's a, agricultural region, makes a lot of sense. You don't have to transport it afterwards. I think that makes sense. But I also think that there is going to be a market for large scale centralized production, particularly if we're talking about exporting large volumes overseas and growing those markets. It's one of the reasons Saudi Arabia has a giga scale facility that they're building at NEOM, and it's partly because it makes sense to do things at scale in order to make them cost effective for export. So they have MOUs with Europe, for example, to export that green hydrogen. So I think there's a role for both. I think it depends on and this is true actually for the whole of the energy transition. There are going to be every region is going to have to look at its available resources, its needs and demands in terms of different types of energy, and sort of optimize around those, right? The less that we have to move the hydrogen around, the better. But that usually means that we're going to have to move around the feedstock that goes into it, right? Either green electricity or natural gas. And so, this is just a big optimization puzzle, and there's going to be solutions that are fit for purpose in different regions depending on the resources available.
Yeah, correct. And another example for decentralized application will be the remote areas, like which are not covered by electrification, like native places. Some of
That's
them.
right. Yeah. Good ad.
Yeah.
Oh, should we talk about the safety? I like this question. Is storing liquid hydrogen dangerous and energy intensive? So hydrogen can be stored basically in three ways. It can be stored as a gas, usually pressurized. We often pressurize it to either 350 bars or 700 bars. The more pressure that you have, the stronger your materials for storing it need to be, because the pressure basically pushes the molecules through the metals. And then we can store it as liquid, or we can even do cryogenic, which is basically liquid under high pressure. And all of them have pros and cons, right? So when we turn hydrogen into a liquid, we have to cool it down to minus 253 degrees centigrade. So that requires a lot of energy. However, it takes up a much less volume for the same amount of energy within the chemical itself. So there's, trade-offs. It's also easier to move it around. It doesn't, leak off when it's a liquid. And cryogenic is really interesting because, again, you get savings in volume, but there are increased safety considerations because it's basically very, very high pressure. So you have to vent the tanks and so on and so forth. So liquid hydrogen has been used for decades. NASA has the largest liquid hydrogen facility in the world. We've been using it for rockets since the 60s. It's not dangerous. It's not dangerous any way that you wouldn't think of storing any fuel. So it's no more dangerous than storing other fuels. We just have to be mindful and put in place, the same types of safety rules and regulations. And that's part of the challenges of building out hydrogen infrastructure, is that the safety considerations have not, up until now, had to have been applied to massive scale infrastructure. So we're working all of those out as we're talking about building these. But I will also say with hydrogen, it's 14 times lighter than air, which means that, as a gas, if it leaks, it is likely to dissipate in a way that natural gas or gasoline would not. So from that perspective, it's actually safer. It has some properties around the ignition of it that we have to take into account for sure, but that are very well known. And we use dangerous chemicals in all sorts of aspects of the energy system and our chemical industries.
Yeah, and it's a different fuel, so at least we have to give that consideration, and we need to know handling it. That's it. It's no more than other fuel. So I think now we are top of the hour. I think I wish I could have we could have addressed more questions, but maybe in following podcast we'll see. And so thank you very much, and I will hand over to Saga for close it.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you again, Naomi and Narendra. This has been absolutely fabulous to hear more about hydrogen and the challenges and opportunities that are posed by it. It was exciting to hear about the transportation as showing the biggest potential for decarbonization. And yeah, definitely didn't put into perspective how NASA has the largest liquid hydrogen facility in the world. So definitely some good takeaways here, and I'm excited to follow along. And thank you all for being here. And please just stay tuned for more events coming from Stanford Alumni and Climate Action, and also from our larger umbrella group, Stanford Alumni and Sustainability. We're super excited to continue bringing you events and shedding light on these types of discussions and topics that need to be addressed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.